Howdy, folks. Welcome to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb, and I am the redneck. You best believe I've gone green, and I'm trying to convince you to do it too. And remember, when we on this program say go green, we mean that in several ways. One way, the most important way, is deep ecology, not merely conservationism or environmentalism, but an understanding of the interconnectedness of all of life, and that all of life is in a interconnected web, and anything that we as humans do to that web, we ultimately do to ourselves. And frankly, whether you come at that from an eco spiritual feminist perspective, or you come at that from a hard science perspective, or like me, you say those are both ways to understand the world, the reality is that is a fact. It is true. We are connected, and the way that humans are currently engaging our political economy is ultimately destroying the planet. The other way we mean that is Green Party. I am a proud and unapologetic member of the Green Party. Now, I work with progressive Democrats all the time and still will. And whenever I can find them, I work with principled conservatives and Republicans. But one thing I do know is this, that the leadership of the Democratic Party and the leadership of the Republican Party are both in agreement about capitalism, about white supremacy, about settler colonialism, about the American empire, and that they do their best to keep ordinary folks, whether they're principled conservatives, liberals, progressives, or moderates, they try to divide us to conquer us. And here on Redneck Gone Green, we have real talk about what it is to be done. How can we break out of this? And that's why I'm so very excited about our program today, because today we're joined by Joe Guinan. Joe is the president of the Democracy Collaborative. He's the co-author of numerous books. The one that I'm really excited to talk about is called People Get Ready, Preparing for a Corbyn Government in England. He's one of the architects of the idea of, quote, community wealth building, and he's a personal friend of mine. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Joe Guinan to Redneck Gone Green. Howdy, Joe.
Hi, David, and thanks for having me. Great pleasure to be with you, and a big fan of all your work.
Well, thank you so much. And so, Joe, like one thing I really like, because I know you as a human being, and I really wanted to actually enter into the conversation so that other people might get to know you a little bit. And so I'm going to invite you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, starting from your childhood all the way up to your early adulthood.
Sure. So I'm actually joining you from just outside Washington, D.C., but I'm an immigrant. I've been in the United States over 20 years, but I grew up in the northwest of England, in the north, where the Industrial Revolution started in Blackburn in Lancashire. Some of you may know of it only from the Beatles song on Sgt. Pepper's, A Day in the Life, 10,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire. But this was really the cradle of the cotton textile industry, the beginnings of modern industrial capitalism, a place where the working class got started in many ways. But I was there with kind of one foot in there and one foot in Ireland, where my father was from. And so for me, growing up, I was kind of a double exile. I always felt English when I was in Ireland, back visiting family and friends over there, or Irish when I was in England. And I grew up in a very political milieu. My dad had grown up through a poor working class family in the north of Ireland, in Warren Point, County Down, and in Newry, and had, like so many other people, left to find work, ended up fighting in the Korean War in the British Armed Forces, killing communists, as he put it, and then left to join the party and spent a few years in the CP, then worked his way through a number of jobs for trade unions and ended up as the local chairman of the constituency Labour Party where I grew up. So my background was kind of, I guess what you call over here a red diaper baby. For me, the system was never my system from day one. And I had a number of vantage points on it, not least the perspective of someone who, whenever we went back to Ireland, to the north, was witnessing the Troubles, as they're euphemistically known, which was really low intensity warfare against the British state. So I always had a distance and a critical perspective from my surroundings in England, and really absorbed what was going on around the dinner table. So, we had lots of visitors, trade unionists and peace campaigners, socialists and international revolutionaries. I remember people from the ANC, people from the Eastern Bloc, in particular, Irish Republicans, always connected back to where my dad had come from. And so I was always going to be a troublemaker and a dissident. And that was my start in life. And then I took an interesting turn and managed to get myself as a young working class kid into Oxford, where I got the benefits of what's supposed to be one of the best educations in the world. Really it opened my eyes to, the factory farming of ruling class elites. And I met some of the stupidest people I've met in my life while I was there. I also was armed with, for the rest of my life, not just the sense that I could go toe to toe with these people, but an understanding that there wasn't really all that much behind the curtain. And so I think it's given me a sense of, I'm not particularly daunted by our upper class betters in all sorts of contexts and
Well,
situations.
Joe, thank you for that. And I really want to move right into it because of your upbringing, the concept of class consciousness was literally part of the dining room table conversation with you, even as a kid. And folks, remember here on Redneck Gone Green, when we talk about class consciousness, we mean it from the Marxist tradition, right? We don't mean merely socioeconomic class. We mean an understanding of who owns the means of production, who actually has decision-making power and authority. That kind of class, the classification of the predatory owning class versus the rest of us. So sometimes we call it the 1%. Sometimes, Joe, I'll have to laugh and say it's really the 1/10 of 1%, right? The real predatory class. But the point is, you had class consciousness from a very early age. Yes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, there was the theory that was always being talked around the kitchen table, but the old saw, theory is gray, but the tree of life is golden green. So it was experience, I think, that really heightened class consciousness and awareness of class conflict and the structure of society around me. A couple of little indicators of dawning class consciousness for me. One was the legend has it in my family that my first political statement was as a toddler in the car, witnessing an army checkpoint in the north of Ireland and turning to my parents and saying, the enemy of these soldiers is the ordinary people, isn't it? And that was the sort of recognition of the power of the state and who it was policing. Another aspect of that for me was economic inequality. We weren't wealthy by any means. Working class family. My mother was the first on either side to have gone to university. We lived in council housing, public housing in American parlance growing up. But we did all right. And I always remember my parents being such passionate believers in equality in terms of education, and that money shouldn't be how you got ahead. That whenever there was a school trip that I wanted to go on, and you had to pay for it, like Thatcher was bringing in charges and that kind of thing at that time, I would have to go in and give money to the teacher, not just for myself, but also explain that I was also paying for someone else who couldn't afford to go, which was excruciatingly embarrassing as a child, but I think really made me aware and brought about empathy and understanding of what it means to not be able to afford to do very simple and basic things. And then, of course,
I want to jump in, Joe, because for me, I had that same experience as a kid out of poverty, and that embarrassment, like so many people take it for granted, right? So like, the reality is that just as people have race privilege, like my skin color and my gender give me male privilege, and my skin color gives me white skin privilege. But class privilege is also real. I mean, the number of people who just think about things like, oh, well, just put it on a credit card, or just pay for the trip to go on a school. Like, for kids in poverty, that shit's not possible, right? And that moment of embarrassment and shame can really shape you. And I like to often say, that for me, there were two things that helped me get past that. The first, therapy, and the redneck is a big believer in therapy. And the second one, Karl Marx. Like understanding the superstructure and systems really helped me to understand how this system is designed. And Joe, I want to make sure because like you've got such a rich history, because I want to bring you. You first got on my radar even when you were in England, because you were one of the early. You were sort of a lieutenant at the Democracy Collaborative. You're the president now, but you entered into movement spaces, at least for me, onto my radar as the leader of the Next Systems project over there. I'm wondering if you can tell us about your experience with the Next System project at the Democracy Collaborative.
Yeah, so I had worked for the Democracy Collaborative way back in the early 2000s and then went off and did a few other things. But they brought me back. I'd always stayed in touch. And a lot of the things that we've been doing there were not quite ripe in the early 2000s, but certainly were ripe by the time I rejoined in 2012 after we'd had the financial crisis. And so with the Next System project, we ran up the flag on really naming the crisis that we were facing as a systemic crisis. And we can talk more if you like about what we mean by that, but also lifting up the extraordinary amount of theorizing and demonstrating that was already taking place in terms of pointing the way to new political, economic institutions and strategies that offered to change the system and that were pathways by which we could do that. And so I've been working over here in the States to advance both the Next System project and also the work that we've been doing on community wealth building. And it actually got taken up by chance. Sometimes you got to go halfway around the world in order to get back where you started, but kind of know it in a different way. And so it turned out that 15 miles from where I grew up in Blackburn was the city of Preston in Lancashire, and they kind of took up the work that the Democracy Collaborative had been doing around community wealth building in Cleveland, Ohio, and made it their own and supercharged it. And this came to the attention of the surprise national leadership of the Labour Party when the Labour Party took a left turn, and they really embraced what we were saying around both community wealth building, but also the wider economics. And so for a number of years, we worked pretty intensively to build out what I think at that point was the most advanced political economic program in the world in terms of responding to the crisis in an advanced industrial country. So there's lots in there. We can unpack that in whatever way suits you, David. But yeah, I was very lucky that the collaborative backed me in doing a lot of work over in the UK, and all that sort of strange conversation around the dinner table, the kitchen table came back, right? I knew the ins and outs of left-wing politics in Britain, and suddenly here we were with a chance to contend for state power in the fifth largest economy in the world. And, we got a lot closer than people expected.
Well, there is so much here, and I'm going to actually slow us down because I want to really dive into this because it's super juicy. And the way I'm going to do it, Joe, is to say, I am going to take you up on the systemic crisis. So for you and listeners, readers, viewers, we're going to talk about the systemic crisis. Then we're going to talk about Preston itself and its experiment with community wealth building. Then we're going to use that to get into the role that you played with the Jeremy Corbyn Labour Party. And when you say left turn, let's be clear, y'all. Jeremy Corbyn was the most explicit, like he is an unapologetic socialist. And there hasn't been an unapologetic socialist contending for state power in England, I'd say, Joe, for 50 years. All right. So like there is something incredibly powerful about that story. So let's circle back, because I think that you, and again, I'm not blowing sunshine up your ass, Joe Guinan, but you have an understanding of the systemic crisis and can break it down without dumbing it down about as good as anybody I've ever heard. So I'm going to put it to you. When you say systemic crisis, what do you mean?
Absolutely. So, and this is not just me, this is the work that the Democracy Collaborative does collectively, but we've basically been saying for the 20 years of our existence that if you look at what is actually happening in the US political economy, and this is true of most other places around the world at the time as well. Essentially, what we're looking at is not local political or economic difficulties that could be solved by limited interventions here or there, but a system-wide crisis of the political economy. And what that means is that under Democrat and Republican alike, in so-called economic good times and bad, the outcomes of the system for most Americans have been getting steadily worse in real terms. And we actually put this together at the Collaborative in something we called the Index of Systemic Trends. The first edition came out in 2019. And we're just about to bring out a second edition 5 years later. But everything we argued in the first index is true still, and even more so. And one of the signs that a crisis is systemic rather than just political or economic is that key indicators decline or stay the same regardless of changes in political power or of business cycles in the economy. And since 1970, the US has experienced, 7 party changes in the White House, 6 party changes in control of the Senate, 4 in the House of Representatives. There've also been economic ups and downs, 7 recessions and recoveries. And yeah, as our index shows, on many of the really important economic indicators, social indicators, indicators of democratic health, what we see is that there's little improvement, and in many cases, very substantial deterioration over this long period since the 1970s. And the trends that we're looking at are things like poverty, wealth inequality, racial wealth inequality, income inequality, wage stagnation, the costs of higher education, student loan debt, home ownership and the racial patterns within that, corporate taxation, taxation of the rich, union density, incarceration rates, labor force participation rates, healthcare costs, and of course, climate emissions and things like life expectancy. And so what you see is the slow buildup of a crisis that is not going to be resolved except by definition with system-changing interventions. And that's the starting point for what we call for, which is the buildup of a democratic economy, although I'd say there are many other versions of similar approaches that fly under other flags, including your own of the solidarity economy. And I would say the overlap is nearly total there.
Exactly. And I want to just really underscore this point, and that is shit's bad and getting worse. And it doesn't matter whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. It doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans in charge of Congress. The hard objective data shows what working class people can tell you, and that is that the rich and powerful have their boot on our neck. They are squeezing us, and they're squeezing us tighter and tighter, and it don't matter whether they have a D or an R next to their name. They are in cahoots. And with that, folks, I'm going to tell you, you are watching and or listening to Redneck Gone Green. I'm your host, David Cobb. I am the Redneck, and I am now talking with Joe Guinan. Joe is the president of the Democracy Collaborative. He's an author. He's a journalist. Most importantly to me, he's a strategist who has a crystal clear analysis about what is happening and what is to be done. Joe, I'm going to turn back to you because part of the what is to be done, like this community wealth building approach or the democratic economy approach, Preston, England is actually applying these theories in the real world. And I want to give you a chance to really, let's talk about Preston as an example about what it looks like when you begin to apply these ideas.
Absolutely. And, Preston got its start really by learning from the first model of community wealth building that we built in Cleveland, Ohio. And Cleveland had gone through waves of deindustrialization and tried almost everything else, including traditional neoliberal smokestack chasing, trying to throw subsidies at corporations to get them to come back and so on. And what we said to them was, wait a minute, look around you. You've got almost everything you need in terms of what you could be getting started with to build a different kind of economy. And if you leave aside the big inward investment model of trying to attract back the Fortune 500 companies that used to be there, and instead look at the rooted economic institutions in your place that aren't going anywhere, whether it's the city of Cleveland government or the big university or hospital systems that are like the Cleveland Clinic, among the top 5 research institutions in the country, never going to leave Cleveland. That's part of their brand and their identity and their commitment. They were spending enormous amounts of money to procure goods and services, and almost none of it was going back into the local economy. And there was even a business case for them, as they're trying to attract top talent to work for their institutions, to make sure that the surrounding community was a good place to live and a place where people could see themselves bringing up their family. And so there was an interest in investing and reinvesting and procuring and making sure that you're managing your economic footprint, which in all too many cases for these anchor institutions is a negative one, right? Gentrification, pushing people out of areas through land development and speculation and so on, and instead look at building a healthful sort of recirculatory economy that's built on local multipliers, spending locally and spending locally again, rather than spending with big corporations that immediately suck the resources out of the surrounding community. And so we set up the Evergreen Cooperatives. You can look them up online. They're thriving. They're worker owned. There's a golden share that the community has, so that they can't be sold off to private equity without the permission of the community. Evergreen is now the second largest minority owned business in that part of Ohio. They pay a living wage. All their worker owners have now built up capital stakes in the range of $10,000 to $20,000, which is a life-changing amount of money to have if your neighborhood has median household income of $18,000. So this was the model that Preston picked up, and Preston was a similar sort of profile, where they were basically in the 20 most deprived communities in England at the time, with very high social and economic deprivation rates. At one point, it was the suicide capital of the North. And they were chasing after the traditional means of trying to grow themselves under neoliberal capitalism. And they were about to do this big white elephant development of the downtown area with the hedge fund money behind it and so on. And then the financial crisis hit and the money went away. And not only did the money go away in terms of future investment, the existing resources coming from central government dried up through austerity and so on. And just the paring back of resources that were going to local governments. And so they were having to do even more with less, and came across the Cleveland model and decided to apply it in Preston. And there's just been an extraordinary development of Preston under the banner of community wealth building, where they've used their procurement, not just of the city council there, which is a tiny district council without enormous amounts of direct spending, but they also have all those other anchors, the University of Central Lancashire, Lancashire County Council, the local constabulary, public pension funds, the resources that are tied to that place that are now being mobilized increasingly for that place. And so Preston has gone from one of the most deprived areas in the United Kingdom to being the most improved city to live in Britain 2 years running. They've massively relocalized or re-regionalized the procurement spending of all those institutions. They've begun to develop worker cooperatives from the ground up. They're pursuing a public ownership strategy with economic development of the of Central Preston, developing a cinema that's going to be in public hands and space for local businesses and local cooperatives to develop. They're talking about redeploying pension money in support of affordable housing and student housing there, and so Preston really has become emblematic in Britain of a different way of doing things locally that doesn't even require additional resources, although of course they're welcome. And so that goes on under the leadership of my friend and colleague Matthew Brown, who's the council leader there, who's also a fellow with us at the Democracy Collaborative, and who really pioneered all this work in Preston and then brought it to national attention, such that there's now something that people refer to as the Preston model, which is the model of doing things differently in place.
And what I love about, so I want to back up a moment, because Jackrabbit, our intrepid executive producer, said, "Hey, wait a minute, Cobb." He says to me in our back channel, "Where the hell is Preston?" So I'm going to give you a chance, and for our listener viewers to say, looky here, y'all. Preston, England is in the northern part of England. not all the way to Scotland, of course, right? But in the northern part of England. But what's really important is it was a poor, is a poor, working class, hard scrabble community of what, Joe? About 120,000 people in the city itself.
Yep, absolutely.
And then I think about 250,000 people in the surrounding area, right? So it's a really good place to experiment. And what I really loved about this is to understand that you're talking what we would call a Rust Belt city in the United States, right? A city that had actually been really dependent upon mining and manufacturing. And when that kind of dried up, because that's what capitalism does after it extracts, people were really suffering. And using this, the community wealth building model or the Cleveland model, where you like have anchor institutions, but you have to have municipal power within the government to facilitate it, because they had, and let's just be honest, people like us in control of what we'd call the municipal state or city government. They were able to actually begin to apply new policies. And so when Joe just casually mentions procurement, what he's talking about is the ability to say, oh, wait, we're going to spend municipal tax dollars differently. We're going for when we need to buy services or materials, we're going to direct them locally. So it really was an experiment in localizing the economy at the state level, but at the small municipal level, right? And so, yeah. So go ahead, Joe.
I mean, one way to think of this is think of community wealth building as really kind of putting on the goggles of an institutional approach to economic transformation locally and looking around and seeing things differently. And this is true of almost any place. It's not just Cleveland or Preston. But if you think about what share of the economy you can potentially control democratically through various channels, direct or otherwise, think about K through 12 education. Think about institutions of higher education. Think about the health system, which in Britain, of course, is a public system, the National Health Service. But even in the United States, this is often nonprofit hospitals, heavily dependent on public dollars and public preferences in their tax treatment. It's other institutions that are nonprofits, cultural institutions, institutions that are in receipt of tax breaks and other things that can be persuaded or out of their own self-interest or through democratic pressure and channels made to look anew at how they are spending money, how they are investing, how they are operating as landowners and stewards of the local environment and so on. And so what we developed was a set of strategies that we call community wealth building, which are wedges, intervention points to drive into the local economy and displace what is essentially extractive corporate behavior and replace it with more democratic, more plural, more locally community, collectively owned institutions, whether they are worker cooperatives or community land trusts or other approaches, the commons, etc. And if you add all this up in place, often you can find that you're talking about something like 40% of any local economy can be controlled and repurposed in this way if you've got political power and the movements and the agenda and the program to pursue it. And so this is really what was developed in a fuller form in Preston and has since traveled elsewhere, all around the world, actually. Sydney, Australia, Wielkopolska in Poland. The Scottish government has a community wealth building minister now and is about to do national legislation. And a lot of this is all about building on this approach and having this done everywhere. There should be 2, 3, many Prestons everywhere we look, because we don't need to wait for someone to come and save us. A lot of the things that we need to do immediately on Monday morning, the levers and possibilities are right there and available to us right away.
And of course, let's be clear, like, Joe, David, like people like us lift up and throw down with local governments. But Joe, you had a unique vantage point in England in large part because of the work that you and others were doing in Preston and other places. You really got connected to Jeremy Corbyn, who, you mentioned earlier in the show, England and the Labour Party took a decided left turn. And let's just say that there's a special place in hell for Margaret Thatcher, to be sure. But right next to that room is the room reserved for Tony Blair. Right, like the neoliberal, the like the Clinton version, right? The Bill Clinton version in England is Tony Blair, who took a hard right turn and took the proud tradition of the Labour Party as a left-red party and really took it in the neoliberal direction. But Jeremy Corbyn, actually, as a militant trade unionist, as somebody who was active in the anti-apartheid movement, as somebody who had a true activist background, who got elected as a member of parliament, when he actually ran and became leader of the Labour Party, something amazing happened, and you were right there with it. So I'm going to invite you to talk about your role in the Corbyn government. And this is, of course, take the time to get there, but I also want to make sure that we have time to talk about people get ready.
No, absolutely, David. So, I mean, for your listeners, think about the Democratic Party. Think about how compromised it is over all of its long history. Think about its left flank. The Labour Party's like that, only even more so, and did actually have a significant socialist and left-wing presence, sometimes in the ascendant. I think people would quibble about how red they've been over the long scope of their history, but certainly they're still living on the credit that they stored up with the British people for the rebuilding of Britain after the Second World War, the creation of the National Health Service, the nationalization of about a fifth of the economy, so that there was public ownership and the working class communities and power that were built around that, and so on. So that's sort of the background on Labour. But more recently, certainly since the kind of neoliberal turn of Thatcher and Reagan, we've seen the Labour Party take a familiar course. If you look at Clinton in the United States, or Schroeder in Germany, or many other illustrations, Australia, France, etc., where essentially there was a wholesale abandonment of the left-wing agenda of trying to transform capitalism, and really an accommodation with neoliberalism and with Thatcherism and Reaganism, and including their imperial foreign wars. And so the thing to emphasize is that Jeremy Corbyn should never have been leader of the Labour Party. It happened by accident, almost by one of those the sort of butterfly effects, where a butterfly flapped its wings and a series of events unfolded. This story is literally the case that a right-wing Labour member of Parliament had one too many pints in the House of Commons bar and punched in the face a Conservative member, leading to basically withdrawal of the party affiliation and the need then for a selection for who was going to run for Parliament in the next election in that seat. And the trade unions that were members of the Labour Party and part of the coalition at the base of the party were putting forward a candidate, and there was basically a backlash against that, such that the then leader of the party even called the police against the trade unions that were trying to organize the selection. And so they decided to change the rules of the party, including the rules by which the party leadership would be selected, thinking that this was a block on the left. And this was before the neoliberal centrists realized just how unpopular their politics are. They thought that if they moved to a one member, one vote system in the Labour Party, that would push the trade unions and the block votes and other channels of influence to one side, and that this would give the sort of enterprising centrists climbing up the greasy pole of their careers the straight shot at controlling the party. And what happened was exactly the opposite. So after the election defeat in 2015 occurred on a pretty milquetoast program, there was just enough votes. It went down to sort of 1 minute to noon when the last nomination came from a member of the parliamentary party for Jeremy Corbyn to get on the ballot. And what happened then was an explosion, and this is familiar to anybody that was involved with Bernie Sanders, and particularly the initial arrival on the scene of a different way of approaching politics. And so Corbyn won the leadership not just narrowly, but by a landslide, by more than all the votes combined of everybody else, over 60%. And this was never supposed to happen. They'd even done something in their hubris where they thought that if they opened up the party selection of the leadership to people that would just pay a small fee rather than being fully fledged party members, that would boost competitiveness and allow for ordinary people, not these left-wing weirdo activists, to have a say. And of course, what happened was that the Labour Party got flooded with these people, and Corbyn won overwhelmingly among them. But frankly,
So I
he'd
got to
also have
stop you,
won.
Joe,
Yeah.
because let's just be super clear about this. It's like if you actually talk plain talk about working class concerns and you put an unapologetic socialist appeal about policies, ordinary fucking people respond. That's the point I really want to make. That, and if you think that I'm oversimplifying it, I want you to correct me, Joe. But that's one of the lessons that I, from, as I've been taught to say, across the pond, I was watching, and Corbyn broke it down without dumbing it down. He talked about issues about renationalizing the public health system. He talked about the railroad industries. He talked about the coal mines. He actually, and he talked about war and empire in plain common sense ways. And working class people and young people in England came flooding back to the Labour Party. That's what I saw.
And thank you for helping me translate this for a US audience. But that's exactly what happened. And so practically overnight, the Labour Party grew to the point where it was the largest mass membership political party in Western Europe. And the thought was, of course, oh, this is just a bunch of student radicals and old unreconstructed dinosaurs from the left of the past coming together and taking over one of the precious institutions of British politics. And so this needed to be beaten back. And so there was an early general election. It wasn't necessary. There'd just been one in 2015. But then the Brexit occurred. There was an attempted coup against Corbyn within the party to try and blame him for what had happened there, rather than take the lesson of Brexit, which was a Rust Belt revolt, really, against the way that things had been going, and another sign of the times. And so Corbyn beat that back with a second leadership campaign that he then won decisively again. And so then there was a snap general election called by then Prime Minister Theresa May to try and annihilate him. He was 20 points down in the opinion polls. The idea was for May to smash Corbyn, get a stonking great majority, and be able to do what she wanted on Brexit, given her own problems in her party. And what happened, there's never been another thing like it, according to pollsters, in all the elections that they've seen. So from 20 points behind, Labour put out a manifesto promising public ownership of rail, mail, and water and energy, promoting workers' rights, pushing a new industrial strategy, pointing towards what we would call a Green New Deal, etc. And this was actually leaked, and I still to this day don't know whether this was an act of sabotage by the right wing of the Labour Party or an ingenious insight into what would happen once it got out by Corbyn's own supporters and immediate circle. But for the first time in history, the draft of the manifesto was leaked ahead of the general election. And there were two stars of that general election campaign. One was Corbyn, the other was the manifesto, which was promising things that hadn't been offered to people. In fact, things that people have been told that they weren't able to have. You can't have good things under neoliberalism because we can't afford it, et cetera, et cetera. All that went by the wayside, and we saw within the general election campaign, the polls tightened to the point where Corbyn was within 1 percentage point. Had, first of all, the biggest swing to Labour since 1945, so achieved 40% compared to 41% for Theresa May, and against all odds solidified his position in the Labour Party, where people for a brief moment acknowledged that there was something going on here that they didn't understand. And while that was happening, that was the opportunity then for us to build out an even more detailed and developed program of what transformative change in an advanced industrial economy would look like. And that's
so,
what
Joe,
we did.
Before we get to people get ready, because I know that you're going to where I wanted to go, but I want to bring Michael Nugent's comment into this because I thought it was incredibly insightful, right? When we were talking about Preston, Michael says, is there a difference between contending for state power and contending for executive and legislative office? Because if the repressive parts of the state continue to exist, will they not go after a democratic, collaborative, and community wealth building project that gains some success? I'm interested to learn how Preston has had to struggle against such repressive parts of the state. And to me, this is a really powerful insight that sets us up with why it's not enough to stay with the local model. Yes, we have to have local building blocks, but we also have to play for state power itself, right? And you and I have talked about that fantastic film, A Very British Coup, right? Like, the reality is that it's not either or, is it? Like, it's not either you build municipal local power or you contend for state power. And I think that, and again, Joe, I'm not trying to be sycophantic, but you have a keen insight into not only the need to do both, but how to do both.
So the immediate place to get started, as we've been talking about, is locally, where you can do things and where it's possible to build pockets of resistance that then can build enough power to take over the local levers and apparatus of the local state in a way that you can begin to do things. And you can actually do quite a lot with that. But the danger there, of course, is what you would call in American terms preemption. And the risk is that you get thus far, there's the power, the danger of a good example, and eventually you're troublesome enough that they will crush you. And this, of course, had happened in Britain in the 80s when the Greater London Council, under the leadership of Ken Livingstone, had a deep red program that it had rolled out, including something very detailed economic plan called the London Industrial Strategy. And eventually Thatcher abolished the GLC. London became the only major city, the only capital city in Europe that didn't have a unified jurisdiction, and they brought back since a London mayor and a London assembly with very different powers. But for a time, the GLC was really contending with Thatcher and was really annoying her because their headquarters was immediately across the River Thames, and so there'd be big banners proclaiming the agenda that Livingstone and other people were pursuing. And so there's important lessons there, right? And whether it's the Paris Commune or many other examples we can point to in history, there's only so far you can get before the state either comes for you or you have to really go for the state, and even from a purely defensive point of view. And so where we were in the UK was we built the demonstration project of Preston, and people had been interested and had taken it up and lifted it up. And so the Labour Party started to lift this up as a model of what everywhere in the country could be pursuing if they would do, and almost as a laboratory experiment, a sort of a microcosm of what Corbynomics, as it got labelled, would look like overall. And we actually got some reasonable coverage, and even in organs of the capitalist press like the Economist, which was genuinely interested in what a Corbyn government, which was a real prospect, would actually get up to. And so what we then began to develop, and this I think goes to the excellent question that was asked, was the notion of how we advance, not just electorally in terms of taking a majority of the House of Commons and then being able to implement a program there, but being aware that the minute we tried to do that, we would face resistance. We would face resistance not just politically from adversaries in other political parties, but also resistance from agents of the status quo within the Labour Party, particularly the parliamentary party, but then also the apparatus of the state, the civil service, who genuinely, in the best sense, are about continuity between governments, and at worst are agents of rolling out the neoliberal program. And we'd also face the countermeasures that would be inevitable from capital, whether that was capital flight, a run on the pound, disturbances in bond markets, etc., all the things that would be potentially disruptive, and that we've seen time and time again, whether it was the Mitterrand government in France or what happened to Syriza in Greece, or the extreme example Allende's Chile, where it was all overthrown by the military. And so the thing that we were developing was the notion that we needed to advance not just electorally, but also within the institutions politically and economically. So going back to the earlier conversation, David, about a democratic economy, the point of that is that, as we were saying, you can win elections, but the danger is that the House still always wins in the institutions of the economy, and that our opponents, the capitalists, the right, always are in office in the institutions of the economy, because those are the institutions that support their agenda: the corporations, the capital markets, the big bank systems, the monopolies, etc. And so what we were developing was a way to toggle back and forth between local advances, policy changes, and then also institutional interventions that would begin to shift the economy in ways that we thought could learn some important lessons from how the neoliberals themselves had done it. And there's a whole story we could go into about learning about exactly how they jiu-jitsu'd privatization into the buildup of the City of London and so on. But our approach was the mirror opposite of that. We needed to tear down the institutions of neoliberal capitalism that are producing all the inequality and the climate collapse and so on, and at the same time use the tearing down of them to build up new institutions, particularly regional banks, public banks, community banks, worker cooperatives, employee ownership shares of companies, which was on the table, which really began to spook the economist at one point, and so on. And so this was quite a sophisticated, or it should have been, toggle among all of these. There are lots of reasons why it didn't work out. In some ways, the argument that I was making with my co-author Christine Berry in People Get Ready was that we weren't ready for all of that. We needed to advance the political education of the movement, such that we understood that it wasn't that Corbyn was going to get elected and deliver from on high. It was that Corbyn, by being elected, would enable us to do the things that needed to happen politically, economically, institutionally, in beginning to build counterpower in a way that could actually resist the pushback and also take space, hold it, and advance from there. That was the name of the game.
Joe, I really want to underscore this point that you're making to listeners and viewers of Redneck Gone Green. Joe Guinan is making a powerful point, in my opinion, and that is that it's not enough to simply have good policies or great people elected to office. If we do not have a mass movement of people who are, in my language, politically conscious, who understand the role that they have in history, that it is up to ordinary people to collectivize and as a class assert our power and right to democratically control how our society operates, we will always lose. And this is why the neoliberal approach of Bill Clinton and of Tony Blair and all these folks are so incredibly dangerous. And I had somebody once say to me, like, what do you even mean by neoliberalism? And so I'm going to literally drop in to the comments section what I think is a short definition of neoliberalism that I think is helps put it into point. And I'm going to read it out loud for those of you who are listening on the podcast and are not able to actually read the comment. Neoliberalism prioritizes deregulation, privatization, and so-called free market principles at the expense of wealth, social welfare programs, and equal distribution of resources. Neoliberalism promotes individualism over collective well-being. Neoliberalism exacerbates economic inequality. It widens the gap between the wealthy and the marginalized. Neoliberal policies perpetuate exploitation, deepen societal divisions, and undermine democratic decision-making processes. And the reason that I really want to be super clear about this is neoliberalism at its core is fundamentally undemocratic. And the only way that we can confront that is if we have a conscious mass movement of folks who understand that they have a role to play with government. It's not enough to just elect Bernie Sanders or to elect Jeremy Corbyn. What people get ready, that I don't know if we call it a full book. It's a robust political screed and pamphlet. But people get ready really called ordinary folks, working class folks, to the role that they need to play. Joe, I hope I'm not laying it on too thick, but I really do think that people get ready was the call that we needed.
Well, thank you for that. And it had a brief moment in the sun for a few months until we met cataclysm for a variety of reasons in the subsequent general election. But I think that what we were trying to do in that moment is advance a set of arguments that I think actually still apply on the left more generally. We're probably further away from state power than we were at the height of the Corbyn and Sanders moments, of course, but these are not questions that aren't going to reoccur. And so one of the interesting lessons of Corbynism really was in some ways, because of that accident, that butterfly effect I was talking about earlier, it presented us with this opportunity for state power at a time when we hadn't done really the hard work of building the movement from the bottom up. And one of the sort of stark lessons, I think, is that there are no shortcuts on political education. We did try and kind of conjure into being our own movement from below, and had been carried forth by basically a democratic insurgency, an uprising that propelled us into leadership of the Labour Party and then into contention for the state. But we weren't ready for the mechanisms that they were able to deploy to undermine us. And our argument in the book was that even had we won power, that was when the real trouble was going to begin. And that was the work that we needed to really prepare for and lay the groundwork for in having a mass movement. I mean, and let's just put this in the context of Britain. The Labour Party reached almost 600,000 members at its peak, which was an extraordinary number compared to the sort of 200 and 250,000 that we'd seen under the centrists, under the Blair.
I'm just going to stop. 3 times. It was 3 times larger under a socialist banner, right? So, like, let's be clear about that level of growth.
And what that meant, David, was a person in every community, on every street corner, capable of interacting locally, of spreading the word, of organizing, of talking to neighbors. And this is the only way in which we were really going to advance, was to really get the word out on what it was that we were offering, why the arguments that were being put against that didn't hold, and to point out that, be ready for when things became difficult, when the going got rough, so that people would understand what was going on in capital markets and the attempt to undermine us from within the civil service and so on, and would come to defend their government that was trying to do their economics, to put things back in their hands through not just public ownership in the old way of switching something from private to public ownership, but essentially retaining the corporate form and in many senses, and this happened in Britain, the same members of the board and so on, but actually to democratize those institutions, to have rail in public hands, but also with stakeholders like workers and local communities and rail users, the passengers, all with a voice in how we were going to run public services. And this is the very opposite of neoliberalism, right? Because what it does is it tears down the artificial barriers that have been erected between the operations of the economy and democratic decision making. Some of them were deliberately there to insulate the economy from the wants and needs of people as expressed through democratic politics. And we were proposing the opposite of that, a democratization of politics as well as the economy in order to deliver what we need.
And Joe, we're coming to the end of the program. So again, folks, if you have not read, and most people I think in the US have not, but People Get Ready, I think is a blueprint for what we should be doing now about how we should be thinking about electoral politics as community organizers. And I'm going to invite you, Joe, to shift into what is to be done now, because there were some lessons learned. I know that you learned from the Corbyn government. You're now the president of the Democracy Collaborative. You've been putting forward this community wealth building approach, the approach of democratizing the economy. So I'm going to put it to you plainly, Joe. What the hell should we be doing now as Trump and fascism is rising across the entire world, right? We are seeing an ecological collapse that's beginning. We're seeing it's not just late stage capitalism, but literally end stage capitalism. We're seeing fascism as an actual political economy put forward. What do you think we should be doing now?
So the thing that's most urgently missing, I think, and we had a stab at this with conversations around the Green New Deal that Bernie and others were part of, is putting forth an agenda and a program that people can understand and see themselves in such a way that they can understand that it's commensurate with the scale of the challenges that we face, right? And these challenges, the systemic crisis that we started out talking about, are increasingly widely recognized. People understand that something's fundamentally wrong with the economy and the inequality it produces. They understand the climate catastrophe that's unfolding, and hopefully they're increasingly understanding that the plan is that the impacts of that will fall on them and not on the people that created this and the economic system that created this. We also see the crisis of racial inequality and the racial wealth gap in the United States. If we're to act on all of these together, we need to build a majoritarian political coalition capable of both defending itself against attacks and of advancing a popular program that people can believe in and understand. And so at the bottom of that, I think, David, and this goes to why I was so eager to join you on Redneck Gone Green, is an inordinate work of political education of the kind that we've never seen in the world before. Although we've got models, we've got the hedge schools in Ireland, we've got forms of education that have been essential to social movement change in American history, from the civil rights movement and the populists and others. And we need to reanimate ourselves with a purpose that is really about, I think many of the answers are there. Many of the models are there in the solidarity economy and community wealth building and other kindred approaches for how we can go about fundamentally changing the institutions of the economy so that we're empowering the economy as well as taking power overall. And so, there's no shortcut, was what we learned, and that they will throw the kitchen sink at us because this threatens everything that they worked for and built and are seeking to protect in terms of their own privilege, power, and wealth. And so we need to be ready for the fight of our lives in the next decade and understand that sometimes we're going to run into roadblocks and sometimes we're going to have setbacks, but it's a checkerboard, as Gar Alpovitz, my mentor and the founder of the Democracy Collaborative, argues. And so you move forward where you can. And if you're blocked, there's always somewhere else that you can move forward. And we need to be taking a long range approach to this such that we get it right, because there aren't going to be any second chances, at least when it comes to climate change. So I think we need the mother of all political organizing and education efforts and the percolation and understanding of these new answers, these new democratic economy models, community wealth building, solidarity economy, and other approaches throughout our movement. So we're not just going cap in hand, asking for crumbs from the table, but asking for the whole damn table itself to be reset on a democratic and equal basis.
And because let's remember, folks, it's ours. It's all ours. Wealth is only created by human labor. Ordinary working people built the wealth of this country. Ordinary working people built the wealth of the world. And I'm going to conclude the program with a reminder, right? And that is that what all Indigenous people know is what our ancestors, regardless of who you are, knew, and the knowledge was stolen from so many of us. And that is, we are all connected, and that wealth only exists in a collective fashion, and that we have to be in balance not only with Mother Earth, but we have to be taking care of all of us. The problem has been that capitalists have lied to us and sold a bill of goods that is simply not true. The lie that they teach us is that individual action and individual responsibility is the only way forward. And what's a lie about this, the reason that they tell us that is because they're in control of the system. That a very small predatory class, not even the 1%, but the 0.01%, literally a small billionaire class, have completely hijacked this society, and they are literally destroying the planet that we depend upon for life itself. And the only way forward is for us to break it down without dumbing it down, to have conversations with people, unsanctioned conversations like we do here on Redneck Gone Green, to convince ourselves and others that we have the capacity to win. With that, I'm going to conclude the show by asking you, as I always do, to please like and subscribe. I know everybody says that, and you know why? Because that's the only way to get past the algorithm. So for those of you who are listening to the podcast, for those of you who are watching the video, we know that literally hundreds and thousands of people are actually watching and listening. Please subscribe to our Substack. We've got 4,000 subscribers and growing. We're going to continue to grow this audience and grow together. And I'm going to thank Joe Guinan, the president of the Democracy Collaborative, for coming onto this program and sharing his insights, his knowledge, his wisdom. And I'm going to invite you to join us next Tuesday, April 16, when Søren Mudliar will join us. Søren is also a friend of mine and Joe Guinan. Søren is the managing editor of Socialism and Democracy, and we're going to do a deep dive into what can be learned from Progressive International and the global tapestry of the alternatives and a growing global movement that is trying to take the lessons learned from Preston and Cleveland and beyond and apply it to win. Can't stop, won't stop, y'all. Peace.